Jason McCrossan on
106.9 SFM.
When Edward Snowden released thousands of pages of highly classified government documents in 2013, he also released the full fury of the American government and, in varying degrees, the American people. And my guest tonight is one of the few that Edward has allowed close enough to interview him in person. He is James Bamford, the author, journalist and former Navy intelligence analyst who's written books and articles about America's National Security Agency. Hello, James.
Good evening. Thanks for having me on your show.
It's a pleasure. It's our pleasure, in fact. Can I ask, how easy or difficult even was it getting close to Edward?
Well, it was very difficult because he was a fugitive in the United States, living in Moscow. I had to go through his attorney, who was a American Civil Liberties Union attorney, and that took a few months before I got permission from both the attorney and Snowden to see him. And then once I flew over to Moscow, it was a lot of encryption. I had to go through encrypted messages to and from Snowden to arrange the meeting, and then there was a certain place I would have to go and be reading a book. And once that took place, then we met, and everything was fine for the next 3 days. We got together. He met me in different places, and so it went fine. But it was a lot of effort and a lot of sort of cloak and dagger activity getting to meet him.
Being in Russia, you would think he would feel relatively safe. What is he in fear of? Does he fear for his life, first of all, and also maybe his liberty? Does he feel that someone might try and grab him?
Well, he didn't appear to be fearing anything when I was with him. He was walking down streets. He came to see me at my hotel a couple of times, and I met him at different places a few times, and he didn't seem afraid at all of either the Russians or the U.S., but what was going through his mind, I have no idea, but he didn't seem to be afraid of anything. He'd been over there quite a while by the time I saw him, so he was fairly acclimated to Moscow. And I don't think he had any fear that he was going to be grabbed by the Russian secret police, and if the U.S. was following him, there was no indications that I had.
What impression does that leave you then for the stuff that you had to go through? Why do you think he's so security conscious, or appears to be so security conscious then?
Well, he's extremely security conscious when it comes to any activity he does on the internet, simply because that's how he got into this business in the first place, was becoming an expert on hacking into foreign and other entities' communication systems. So he knows the vulnerabilities, and because he knows all those vulnerabilities, he tries very hard to not give away exactly where he is by using encryption and Tor, a lot of other different techniques to hide both his location and his digital location, and also hide what he's saying and who he's communicating with.
So he fled to Russia to avoid America getting their hands on him, and I'm not even sure whether he was that keen to end up there. Did he really understand the implications of what he was doing? Did he understand what releasing all these documents would mean for him?
Well, I don't think he really had that much of a concept of what would come, because his first idea was to flee the United States with all the documents and then seek asylum in Hong Kong. That didn't last very long. It lasted only about a week, and then it turned out the Chinese government, which controls Hong Kong, was going to apparently arrest him and then turn him back to the United States. That's why he fled Hong Kong to go to Ecuador, where he was granted asylum. So in order to get to Ecuador, he had to fly from Hong Kong and change planes in Moscow. What happened was, after he took off from Hong Kong, the U.S. canceled his passport. So when he got to Moscow, going through the passport check, a big red light came on because his passport wasn't valid, and because it wasn't valid, he wasn't allowed to get onto the airliner going to Cuba, which was then going to go on to Ecuador. So as a result of that, he was stranded in the airport in Moscow. It had nothing to do with ever wanting to go to Moscow or have anything to do with Russia. He's there basically because of the United States, because the United States canceled his passport. And then after a month or so in the transit lounge at the Moscow airport, the Russians finally granted him asylum. So there was absolutely no intention to ever go to Russia when he took the documents.
So you spent 3 days with him. What was your kind of overall impressions? Were you impressed? Were you nonplussed? What did you think?
Well, I was extremely impressed for a number of reasons. One of them was his dedication. He gave up an enormous amount to get these messages across, and having written about NSA for about 30 years now, done 3 books, a couple of documentaries, and innumerable articles on NSA. It's a topic I've followed for a long time, and so I was extremely impressed by his dedication. First of all, he not only was not a college graduate, he didn't even graduate from high school. He only finished 10th grade, although he's extremely smart. But even though he only had less than a high school education, he had a job in Hawaii, a wonderful place that was paying $120,000 a year. He had a very attractive girlfriend. He was living a very good life. So he gave up a lot to go on the run, basically, and face the potential of life imprisonment. So he was very dedicated to get the message out to people that the NSA was going well beyond what people thought it was doing, and it was actually eavesdropping on millions of Americans and millions of people around the world that were totally innocent, that had nothing to do with terrorism or anything else.
Were you surprised by any of the revelations from Snowden? Did it actually surprise you that they were tapping people up, and foreign governments and foreign ministers and prime ministers? Did that surprise you at all?
A lot of his revelations surprised me a great deal. And as you mentioned, I've been writing on NSA for a very long time, but that was what was so astonishing to me, was how much I didn't know about NSA, and how enormously aggressive NSA was against not just going after terrorists or looking into what China and Russia, North Korea, and so forth are doing, but what average Americans, average Europeans, average people around the world were doing, that the NSA had really no legitimate interest in spying on.
As you've alluded to there, he's given up a lot. In fact, he's given up his life for this. When you spoke to him, does he sound like someone who feels like he's got to justify everything that he did?
Well, yeah, he's very serious. It was sort of hard getting a laugh out of him about anything because he is very serious. And his main goal in life at this point, or at least at the point when I met with him last year, was to make sure that everybody understood the importance of the documents that he went to a lot of trouble to release. And I think he was very happy with the way it worked out. The documents got an enormous amount of attention. They've changed a lot of the way Americans think about NSA and think about security. And they've changed the laws. There's been a number of laws that have come under scrutiny and been changed because of what Snowden did. When I was speaking with him, he told me that he was unsure when he left the United States whether this would be a one-day story. People would forget about it after a day, and that would be the end of it. So he was very pleased with the way the story has continued and the results of all his efforts.
When you were interviewing him, did you just speak about general life and about how he is in Moscow and how he's finding it? Did you sort of have sort of intimate conversations, if you will?
A fair amount. We spent 3 days together, and so we got on to a lot of different topics. At one point, we were in a tall hotel, and he was pointing out some of the landmarks in Moscow, almost like a native would point them out to a tourist at this point. He struggled to order a pizza one time in Russian, as Russian wasn't very good. But he was acclimating quite well. He said that he avoids any place where American tourists might go. He goes mostly to Russian computer stores and wears a hat and so forth. So it's very rare that he's ever recognized. So, yeah, he talked a fair amount about his personal life there.
I read some of the leaks that may have been attributed to Edward Snowden may not have actually come from him. I think it was in the article that you had written. Is there a concern that there are actually more leakers who are leaking?
Well, I think there are, actually. I did bring that up with Ed Snowden because there was one document, at least a series of documents that I asked him about, and he said, well, they didn't come from me, so they must have come from somebody else. So there is at least one other whistleblower out there that some people are attributing some of those documents to him. It's very confusing because if somebody wants to be a whistleblower, they could very easily hide their identity by pretending the documents are actually coming from Snowden's archive. I'm one of the few people who's actually gone through the archive, and there's a huge amount of material in there, but there are some documents in the public domain now that didn't come from the archive.
And one of the other interesting elements is the fact that there may still be some documents that haven't been unearthed yet, which could contain some quite damaging material once they are found.
I mean, we're talking about an enormous amount of documents. The U.S. government was claiming 1.7 million. I don't think it's really anywhere near that. It's probably more like 250,000 or something like that. But it's still a great deal of documents, and I think between the people who have actually looked at them, they've all been sort of glanced at one point or another, but the problem is they haven't really been analyzed or looked at very closely at this point. When people go through the Snowden documents, the people who have access to them, you look through them by way of sort of like a Google type of a search. There's a search engine, and you'll put a word in, or several words, or a phrase in, and then you see what documents come up. So if you, so it's not as if you're sitting there and going through document after document. You go in, you look through the documents as if you're looking through a huge archive with a Google-type search engine.
Okay, James, well, listen, let's take a break at this point, and we'll return and discuss more about the implications and the impact of what's happened since the documents were released.
Great, Jason, thank you.
When Edward Snowden released thousands of pages of highly classified government documents in 2013, he also released the full fury of the American government and, in varying degrees, the American people. And my guest tonight is one of the few that Edward has allowed close enough to interview him in person. He is James Bamford, the author, journalist and former Navy intelligence analyst who's written books and articles about America's National Security Agency. I was reading an article in the Times here in the UK which said that these documents had devastated Britain's ability to fight terrorism. What's your analysis of just the impact, as far as you can work out, of the release of these documents?
Well, you really have to take what the NSA and the GCHQ say with a grain of salt. Every time I've ever written anything, every time one of my books has come out, every time a documentary's come out, they say the same thing. They've been saying that for 30 years now. And they just keep on managing to be able to eavesdrop more and more every year. There hasn't been any indication whatsoever that any of the documents have brought harm to anybody or canceled the U.S. or the British ability to go after terrorists. They've never had a very good ability to go after terrorists in the first place. I mean, they've missed 9/11, for example. They miss enormous number of terrorists, not because of Snowden, but because they have too much information coming in and not enough analytical capability. They have far too much information that they're intercepting and far too little that they're actually able to understand or analyze.
Through meeting Edward and just through the books that you've done and the work that you've done, do you think that your communications are monitored? So, for example, this call now, could this over Skype that we're doing now, could this be being monitored, do you think? Do you think it's brought some heat to you?
Well, obviously it could be monitored. As I said, I've written the very first book on NSA back in 1982, and I've been writing about NSA ever since then. So that question comes to me all the time. I've never really gotten any indication that they are actually eavesdropping on me. I don't really know, and I don't really go about my life. I don't change my life under the assumption that they are eavesdropping on me. But in terms of my working ability, I do take enormous numbers of precautions. I use encryption when I'm communicating with people on the internet. And when I'm actually interviewing people, I never do that either over the internet or over the phone. I always do it in person. So I do a lot of precautions just in case I am eavesdropped on, but I don't run around hiding from place to place, assuming that NSA's been doing it. Again, I've been doing this for more than half my life, so I'm not really concerned on a day-to-day basis about it.
Well, if they are listening, hello! Did you talk about his future? Did you talk about the fact that I suppose he may now be stuck in Russia for the rest of his life?
Oh yeah, we spent a fair amount of time talking about his future, and a lot of Americans think of Moscow back in the Khrushchev days. It's a lot different from that. It's a very livable place. He doesn't like the politics of the Russian government, but in terms of living ability, it's not that bad a place to live. But his ultimate goal was to come back to the United States, if possible. He said he'd even take a prison sentence if he had to. But that would have to be something that was negotiated beforehand. In other words, 5-year prison sentence or whatever. He didn't specify a particular number of years or particular length of time. But he did say he'd be willing to go to jail. The question would be working out the arrangement beforehand. So he would work out an arrangement with the U.S. government in terms of how long he would spend in jail, and if it was agreeable, he would come back and do the jail time and then live happily ever after in the United States. The problem is they've made that offer to the U.S. government, but the U.S. government has not even acknowledged it or gotten back in touch with them. So at this point, I think he's becoming less and less hopeful of actually coming back to the United States and becoming more and more accepting of the fact that he's probably going to be living in Russia for a great many more years.
And if he did come back to the United States, what would be the welcome like, do you think? Is it a 50-50 split, would you say, in America, whereas 50% think that he did a good thing and 50% don't, or is it not quite as close as that?
I think it's probably somewhere between 50 and 60% that are, have a positive view of what he did. It's changed a great deal from the very beginning, largely because people have come to accept the fact that he didn't do this for money. He didn't do this for glory. He did this for one particular reason, an altruistic reason, to help the American people understand what the U.S. government is doing that's largely illegal. So I think that message has resonated with a lot of people in the United States, and I think is time goes on, there's going to be a lot less animosity and a lot more acceptance of his situation in the United States.
Did you grow fond of him whilst you were there then? Did you like him at the end when you left?
Yeah, I liked him a great deal because he was extremely sincere. I've met lots of people in my past, having been a journalist for 3 decades, who are not sincere, who are looking for glory or money or whatever. And he was extremely sincere. And, we both had a lot in common. I'd been writing about NSA for many years, and he'd worked there for many years. And, we both he knew far more about computers than I did and computer security. So it was a very fascinating conversation. And again, he doesn't see an awful lot of Americans. I'm one of the very few that actually have been over there to spend time with him. I think I've probably spent more time with him in Moscow than any other American at this point.
Do you think you'll write a book about it? Are you going to follow it up with any more articles or books?
I'm not planning to right now. There have been several books written about him, and they've pretty much covered all the ground. So right now I have a documentary that's coming out day after tomorrow, actually, on Wednesday over here on PBS Nova. So I'm working on documentaries and articles, and I'm a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, so I'm fairly busy. I don't really have time to do another book right now.
And will we be able to pick that up over here? Will it be on one of the satellite channels?
I know we worked out arrangements with the French and the Germans and Japanese and I think a few others, but I don't think we have it worked out with the BBC yet. But usually the way it works is once the program airs, then there's negotiation with the BBC as to whether they want to purchase the film or not. It's a film on it's a 1-hour documentary on cyber warfare, focusing primarily on NSA, and I spent an hour doing an on-camera interview with Ed Snowden about that topic. And it was extremely interesting because not many people realize, but that was what his last job was at NSA, was working as a cyber warrior, working in the cyber warfare area. So it was extremely interesting interviewing him, spending an hour interviewing him on camera about that. And again, that's going to be part of this documentary where the PBS, Public Broadcasting System in the United States, is going to broadcast on Wednesday.
James, thank you very much indeed for your time.
I appreciate it, Jason. Good luck with the program.